those same firms are calling me and saying, we really like the work you do. We've got a client in Denmark, which has happened. We've got a client company in Denmark. Would you be willing to work with them? So I'm on the phone at 7 o'clock in the morning. They're in 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But from me, it's been nice because now I'm getting to work with people that I wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity to work with.
Welcome to the Execs.Coach podcast. Are you a business leader or someone with aspirations of improving your leadership skills? If you're looking to uncover what it takes to be a successful leader in today's environment, listening to the Execs.Coach podcast will be well worth the investment of your time. Now, let's jump into the conversation with Executive Coach Ed Rankin and serial entrepreneur Doug Parker.
All right, we're back on the Execs.Coach podcast, and we are on episode number 4. So we're 4 months into this, Ed. Can you believe that?
It's gone pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt about it. I mean, it seems like it was just yesterday we were doing the first podcast. And, the reality is we're covering a bunch of content. We're talking about coaching. We're talking about just business in general, talking about life, our experiences. We're hoping that the audience is getting as much out of this as we are. And so anyway, with that being said, I'm Doug Parker.
I'm Ed Rankin.
And we are here today on Execs.Coach podcast. Everything that we talk about, we're going to put on the podcast, obviously, show notes. They're going to be on Execs.Coach. Okay, so not exec.com, but Execs.Coach. That's a new URL that's out there for those of you who don't know. But yeah, we're just going to talk today a little bit about really remote leadership, and kind of this post-COVID world. I mean, everybody was forced into a remote style environment, for about a year or so. And it created some great opportunities. It also created some challenges. So we're going to talk just a little bit about that and how, you can benefit from those things now.
Yeah, Doug, just in the last few months, I started working with a client in New York City, and they have some of the most expensive real estate in Lower Manhattan. And they had leased this space right prior to the COVID. So I went to visit, and the executives are there. The top half dozen executives are officing there for the most part, but everybody else is working from home. And it's really kind of weird because I was walking through, they haven't even finished the build out. So you've got concrete floors and open space for the most part in this couple of floors. Literally, they're down on some of the most expensive, down in the financial district in Lower Manhattan. And they're still not, people aren't coming back to the office.
From years ago.
From years ago, yeah, they're still working from home. It's become so popular now. Companies are really struggling trying to get people to come back to work.
No doubt. Well, we talked about different generations and different folks, but there's a lot of people that are the maybe old school guys that they were very much anti remote working when it first started.
Yep.
And then, you're forced into something, and, we talked about change and how uncomfortable that can be, but then you get through that tunnel of chaos, if you will, and that chaos becomes back into order, and you figure out, not everything that's changed is bad.
Right.
So let's talk about maybe some of the strengths of the remote environment. Let's talk about what's considered a strength, would you say, being able to be remote in the coaching world or just operating a business in general?
Well, it's really interesting, actually, because prior to COVID, I was paid by most of my clients to work with their executives in person. So it wasn't unusual for me to spend a good part of my week on an airplane, flying to California, flying to Austin or Houston, or flying to DC area to have in-person meetings with some of my clients.
Yeah.
Today, it's actually, I wasn't quite sure how this thing was going to impact the coaching profession, but people have adopted to the Zoom and the online meetings so readily that, I actually find, and I actually, as a coach, initially I was concerned that it wouldn't be as effective because I like that in-person connection with the other human being. But what I found is, for me as a coach, that it works just about as well, perhaps, as an in-person meeting, but I can be a lot more productive because I'm not spending a lot of time on the plane. So I think it's probably similar to other people that they're not commuting. I know that's one of the things I hear from my client companies is their employees really are, the time that they would spend, like look at the Lower Manhattan location. It probably takes a lot of effort for some people to get from New Jersey or Connecticut into New York every day to go to sit in the office. Yeah. So they're not having to spend that time commuting anymore. So I think that's certainly one of the benefits. And then, I think the tools have gotten so much better. I've noticed even in the last few years, all these different online applications have improved so much that video and audio quality is much better. And it's readily available. Everybody's kind of used to working with it now. So I think that we've kind of crossed over the chasm there as far as acceptance.
Yeah.
But although I think that a lot of companies are realizing that there's some benefit for in-person meetings and benefit for having people together. So I think where we're headed is more of a blend where you spend a couple of days a week in the office, the rest of it at home. And it's less expensive real estate for a lot of these folks. So they don't need to maintain as much. So the fixed cost, the overhead associated with having offices for everybody, that's kind of been a nice financial benefit to the employers.
Yeah, I've seen some of them that go like 2 days this week, 3 days next week, and then you can rotate your teams where they operate out in the same offices, but essentially you've got half as much real estate needed to house the same amount of people.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
So it works out really, really nice there. And you had talked about some of the strengths of, like Zoom and maybe I think there's another application, Teams with Microsoft. But one of the integrations that I have seen personally with Zoom is, and I'm not necessarily promoting it, it's just something I'm familiar with, but there is some AI that incorporates with Zoom that I've got where it gives you back this report and it shows engagement. It talks about things, it sends me a report back and it tells about how engaged was a person, who kind of dominated the conversation, what are follow-up questions that you could go with. And it's just part of the package that I have with Zoom. But I know you've got another program that's part of your Zoom that we're actually kind of trying out as part of this podcast. We're recording some of this technology to see what we can strengthen. But what's the name of that program and kind of how does it work?
Yeah, I use this application called Heyday, Heyday, and it takes a Zoom transcript and analyzes the conversation. And when I finish a coaching call with a client on Zoom, about an hour or so later, I'll receive a report from Heyday, which summarizes my conversation with my client. It will also provide me as a coach links to some relevant research material that's relevant to the conversation I had. I then can share that with my client as a follow-up. It'll record any commitments that the client makes to himself or herself during the meeting. So I can send that back. I have a chance to edit it. I can look at it, read it, edit it. And if there's some things in there that I don't think are appropriate or don't fit, I can take those out. Then I can send that to the client. And it's simply, in many cases, just a reminder. Hey, towards the end of our discussion, we talked about some objectives. This report includes the things you mentioned. You might want to take a look at that. Let me know what you think. So I think, again, for coaching, my view on this has been for a long time that I don't think you can fight AI. If you're a coach, if you're afraid of it or you're threatened by it, you're probably going in the wrong direction. I think we need to look and see how can we incorporate these tools into the coaching process. Do they bring value or not? And in this case, I feel like it does. And particularly if I'm having multiple discussions about one individual. So one of the things we do in coaching that's fairly common is we'll do what's called a 360 interview. So I will ask my client to give me the names of usually 3 or 4 people that they report to them, 3 or 4 people that they interact with, could be peers, their boss. And we'll set it up so I'll call each of these people. We'll have a phone call about my client's leadership style, work habits, things like that. So it gives me some feedback from people that see and work with my client every day about some potential developmental opportunities for him or her. When I use Zoom for those calls, it collects all of that data together and it compiles it. So when I'm writing that kind of summary report for my client, it's kind of all there. Yeah. And it's all captured. And so, again, I can edit it, take some things out if I don't want them to be included. But these tools, I think Heyday particularly is a really valuable tool for coaches. So, and there are other things I know will be coming on the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And AI, you mentioned that. That's obviously one of the strengths. And I'm sure before this podcast is said and done, we'll probably do a whole entire episode or multiple episodes on, AI and how to integrate those things into your business, and we probably bring on some expert that knows far more about it than we do. Right. But it's neat just seeing how Zoom, for instance, just 4 or 5 years ago was a totally foreign thing. I mean, almost nobody used Zoom.
Right.
And then instantaneously overnight, it became one of the most valuable companies in the world.
Yes.
And it forced them to fix some of the glitches. And then there are things where, it exposed through this change, people, sharing links and people doing obnoxious things that weren't part of the calls, and they had to figure out ways to block them and how to secure those links. And then, but it's really interesting now just seeing how you take this basic technology, it was pretty sophisticated technology actually, but you take that and they do these add-ons, and it turns around and gives you a report that you can use, makes your job so much easier instead of you taking notes the whole entire time.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got that to be able to come back in and report. So that's definitely a strength. And you talked about the 360 review. Let's talk about that for just a second, because I don't want to skim over it. It's not necessarily part of remote leadership per se. However, different people have different opinions of themselves. You know what I mean? Yes. I find that most of the time people have a slightly inflated view of themselves, and they have a slightly deflated view of others. I mean, that's just kind of a natural thing. But when you talk to people that are their peers, people that are supervisors, you get that 360 review of others doing a review, and you can compare and contrast it to what they obviously say about themselves as well. Now all of a sudden you can really kind of deduct, okay, there's this side, there's that side, there's kind of here's in the middle. And you can communicate with them. So I'm assuming you take all that information, talk to them, and you say, hey, do you find that people change slightly their own review themselves after they get information from others, or do they say, nah, they're wrong? Or maybe a little bit of both?
It's a little bit of both. Some people will fight the information. They'll argue with it. Mm-hmm. I've got one client now that, when I was going over reviewing the results of my 360 conversation with his team members, with him, he said, "Oh, wait a minute. I know why they said that. That's not right. That's not really me," kind of thing. And it was really interesting because one of his criticisms that he received almost from consistently across the board with everybody I spoke with is that he doesn't listen. So when I'm giving this feedback, I'm saying, "You're not listening now. I mean, I've just told you that you're listening. You're trying to explain to me why they're wrong, so you're not really listening." And it got his attention. He said, "Yeah, I guess you're right." But I think, so it varies. I think what's really helpful, I think, a lot of times is for me as a coach to have the insight from people that actually work with that person, because I'm there episodically. I'm there every other week for an hour and a half on a phone call. I don't get to see how the person actually behaves in the work environment. Mm-hmm. So, and this can be really good. These feedback loops, we all need feedback loops, right? And so I think a leader if a good leader will take this information in 360, whether they agree with it or not, they may disagree with what was said, but if it's connected properly, the 360, these people it's their perception. Whether he or she agrees with their perception or not, really is not relevant. What's relevant is to the coaching process is, I've got a leader that is probably not self-aware, not willing to become more self-aware.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, the remote part of it, I know you said that, now you're doing more of it remote.
Yeah.
We talked about some of the strengths of the remote stuff, but then there's also the weakness side of it, right? So there's, from a coaching perspective, some of those weaknesses, but then also there's just people being remote in general. Let's talk about some of those weaknesses that may be there. What are your thoughts on what's a drawback of not being in person?
Well, I think probably most people would agree, and I've talked with people about this a lot, with my clients, is that you don't have the opportunity for that impromptu interaction, that discussion in the hallway you didn't intend to have. It could be someone that you're struggling with, it could be someone that you're really in line with, but you meet, just ad hoc, it was unplanned. And I think sometimes we underestimate the value of those discussions. So and I think working remotely, you lose some of that. I think that's probably the biggest challenge. There are ways to address that, but you have to be more deliberate about it. So then I think you can do some things to try to bring some of that into a remote working environment, but you've got to be purposeful. You've got to be intentional.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about, like cultures, one of the things I have found over the years that's worked for me is the in-person. So from a training perspective, one of the things I like to do is kind of modeling process. So it's like, I do and you watch, okay? Yes. Then I do, okay, and you help. Yeah. And then maybe you do and I help. and then you do, and I watch.
Yep.
So you go through that whole process of those 5 different stages, and it just really allows people, it's not a formal training per se, but what it does is it allows you to kind of play the telephone game. You just listen to what I'm saying, do what I do, and if you have kind of a similar process, it's going to be, highly likely you're going to have a success on a similar level that I have. But when you're not around people, what tends to happen is they'll hear something else or they'll do something slightly different, and before you know it, whatever they're doing comes out totally different than what you had trained them to do. Whereas if you're sitting next to them, you're listening and they're saying something, oh, hold on a second, like it's kind of close, but like change that just a little bit, let's do this. And that's where that kind of, it's the reason why you and I both speak English is because our parents spoke English, right? And the reason why some people speak Spanish is because their parents spoke Spanish. Correct. We didn't train anybody how to speak, okay, for the most part, unless it's a second language. We just know how to do stuff based upon listening. That's how we learn naturally. And so that's one of the things, from a strength standpoint that I love about the in-person side of it. But the remote side of it, I feel it's a weakness for my leadership style or my training style because, me training on a Zoom and just, I don't know about you, but I see people turn off their camera on Zooms. I see where, people aren't really as dialed in and tuned in, or they got, their dog barking in the background, their kid saying this or that or whatever. And while it's great having them in if they're in New York and I'm in Texas, that's great. The problem is that to get undivided attention is much more difficult, I have found, on those remote type environments.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question of that. And, people aren't, it depends. But I think in most cases, there's at least, some small portion of the attendees who are doing something else other than attending.
Yeah, they can definitely be, there's some famous cases of people on Zoom doing things that weren't what they were intending to be doing.
That's true.
So,
right after, it's not long after the remote stuff really took off. A friend of mine sent me a screenshot from a meeting he had been involved in, and one of the attendees was sitting in their underwear. They didn't realize they were dressed from the waist up, but their camera had tilted down. Their camera tilted down, so they were now there. So yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting world. That's definitely one of the situations that can be problematic. So we've gone over some of the strengths, we've gone over some of the weaknesses. But let's talk about opportunities. I mean, kind of the old SWOT analysis, we're on that, but what kind of opportunities do you see in the future, specifically as it relates to coaching, that could come in handy either as a coach, in your position to the executive level, or someone that works in a company that's doing coaching with their organization using some of the remote styles?
Well, one of the things that comes to mind is prior to COVID and the use of technology, people were hiring coaches kind of based on geographic location. Okay. So, for example, there are several firms around the country that provide coaching services as part of their offering. And occasionally I get a call from them and say, hey, I've got someone in Dallas and we'd like to find, would you be interested in doing this, subcontracting and doing this for us? So, but today, those same firms are calling me and saying, we really like the work you do. We've got a client in Denmark, which has happened. We've got a client company in Denmark. Would you be willing to work with them? So I'm on the phone at 7 o'clock in the morning. They're in, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But from me, it's been nice because now I'm getting to work with people that I wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity to work with.
That sounds like a tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, so really, someone like me can now work globally without traveling.
Yep.
So, which is kind of fun.
Yeah,
and I'd say the same thing for people internally. I think because in a way, you think about it, you could have, because the costs associated with it are not quite. So if you're bringing everybody in for a meeting, this allows maybe large participation by larger groups of employees into a discussion they wouldn't otherwise be able to do because you don't have the money to bring them to a location.
Right.
So I think there's definitely some benefits.
Yeah, and I could see with someone like in your role. So if you've got someone you're doing coaching with, in the past maybe you're spending an hour or two a month with them in person. But if you had to do it in person in the past, and they were on the East Coast and you're in the central part of America, and you're having to travel, a day there, spend a day really for an hour or two of coaching, fly back later that day, you got 2 full days tied up, you have to charge a price that is commensurate with that much of your time. And they've got airfare involved and all those kind of things. Now, you literally have an hour of your time instead of maybe 16 billable hours and travel expenses. And so that makes quite an opportunity for you to be able to get in front of a lot more people. And now you can get in front of 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 people in those 2 days as opposed to just that one. So that could be a definite opportunity there.
Yeah, some things are certainly still done in person. I think it's still best done in person. So, in the last few months, a couple of companies have asked me to come in and facilitate what most people would consider a team building session. But it's really more of a kind of creating a way of working together, getting a group of executives to agree on how they're going to interact with one another. And so it usually is a couple day process, usually 1 full day and a half day to carry everybody through this. But at the end of that process, we hope we have, the goal is to have literally a written list of ways of working together that the group will adopt, and they each sign off on it, and they have full participation in the development of those issues. But it works really, really well, particularly for a new group. One of those I did was an early stage. It was a biotech company based in the Research Triangle, and is a new company, a lot of money invested, stakes are pretty high. You got a lot of smart people working together. I mean, PhDs, and MBAs and attorneys, and they're all very opinionated and strong-willed folks. So we spent time with them to get them to agree on how they're going to collaborate as a group. That's hard to do that remotely.
Yeah. So that definitely makes sense as kind of a, and that kind of ties in nicely kind of with the threats, if you will, that last piece of it. So, what would be a threat of the remote learning or the remote coaching that you're seeing coming in? We talked about how AI, there's some stuff there and there's some benefits to having some of the AI, but the more remote we get, the more those things happen. What are some of those threats you think?
Well, one of the first things that comes to mind is security. And particularly if you're having conversations, let's see, about corporate strategy and sort of what conversations that should be considered private, and how secure is that network? How secure is that group of people on the call?
Absolutely.
Are they recording something? And so I think that's probably the biggest. As I look at it, that's one of the biggest threats. How I think you have to be careful about the nature of the discussions you're having online.
Yeah. Well, and that brings up a couple points here. So there might be some lack of transparency because it is being recorded, and it creates a digital footprint. My dad had told me a long time ago when the internet first came out, I sent some kind of stupid little online, it wasn't a GIF or whatever back then, but I sent something, and he was like, just remember, everything that you send out has a digital footprint, lives forever at that point.
That's true.
And so now you've got a situation where, you've got something with your name attached to it that, I don't know about you, but there's a ton of things in my life that I'm not necessarily proud of. You know what I mean? I've just been young and dumb. I'm not as young as I used to be. Maybe I'm not quite as dumb as I used to be, I hope also. But there's a lot of things I would do differently. The problem is when you digitize things, it's out there forever.
That's a good point.
And so, I think that could definitely be a threat where someone might be less transparent. They may have a situation going on at work that they're not super proud of. You know what I mean? I think a lot of people have experienced things like that, and they may not want to talk about it in a recorded Zoom. And so other things are, these Zoom links. We talked about, people crashing these Zooms in the past. When you're doing things, just having your Zoom link, that's your standard Zoom link that you're sending out to people, you got to be careful, I guess, about making sure that there's an independent one for them. You're not just using your generic one and then somebody else jumps on there. I've done some Spanish classes. I'm working on my Spanish, trying to get a little better at that language. But one of the things I had experienced before was I'd jump on in a scheduled time, or what I thought was a scheduled time, and I'd jump in the middle of somebody else's coaching class. Oh. And it was because the school I was using, they just happened to use the same link for everybody. And it wasn't anything that was super high priority or nothing like that. Right. It was just a matter of I accidentally crashed theirs. But let's say it was a coaching deal and they were talking about something sensitive and I'm sitting there with access and I'm just listening, and maybe they know I jumped on or maybe they don't know I jumped on. Maybe it's entertaining to me and it's like a soap opera. I'm listening a little while. I wouldn't do that, but people will, okay? And to your point about being able to record it, man.
Yeah, and I'm used, another thing that comes to mind, I think about coaching is, I historically I've never taken notes for a bunch of reasons, but primarily because I don't want my client to be distracted by my note taking. Mm-hmm. So, if suddenly I start writing something down and my client thinking, what did I say? Maybe did I say something wrong? Or, so I haven't done it. But now with the Zoom calls, if I'm going to use Heyday, I tell my clients, I'm recording this, and here's what's going to happen with the information, to give them the option of saying no.
Yes.
Because I want them to be able to say no. Now, on another potential liability for coaches is anything that's recorded, whether it's notes or other things, is discoverable if there's a legal action.
Yep.
So that's another reason to maybe be cautious about how you use it.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, and this is, I guess, something that everybody needs to be aware of it as a company. Disclosures. If you're doing a bunch of remote stuff, it's one thing to have a conversation with somebody, but recording things, there's different states that have different rules. Some states
EU is very different.
Yeah.
EU,
well, worldwide. So there's some states where if I know I'm recording it, I can record me, no problem at all with anybody else. Right. But there are some states it's two-party consent. So both parties have to know it's being recorded. Yep. But, people have selective memory also. You know what I mean? They I didn't know that was being recorded. But, maybe having some kind of disclosure that you have somebody sign. I'm not giving any kind of legal advice, but I've spent enough on attorneys that I feel like I've educated 2 or 3 of them and the fees I paid. But I've definitely learned a lot through those things. And so you definitely want to seek wise counsel on those types of things. But there may be something, if you are doing a lot of Zoom calls, if you're doing a lot of remote type things that's being recorded, that you have, the people, sign off something. And I think actually I saw this a while back on Zoom. If it's being recorded, before they can enter into the room, it requires them to click a button that says they understand that it's being recorded. Yes. I think that is now a standard part, and it probably has something to do with that. But again, I wouldn't count on another company to defend me in making sure everything was done right. I would always want to have my own disclosures and those kind of things. So definitely seek legal counsel for that. Well, Ed, we have covered a whole bunch of information again on the Execs.Coach podcast. I really enjoy, kind of getting to know all this information, and anything that you might have missed, we're going to put it into the show notes with links, and we'd love to have your feedback. If you want to reach out to us, we're happy to help and answer any questions in any way that we can. Of course, Ed is an executive coach. He helps out executives get to the next level. I'm an entrepreneur, really a serial entrepreneur that's done all kinds of things. I'm kind of dipping my toe in the water for my next cycle of life. What is that going to look like? And maybe I'll do a little bit of coaching. Maybe I'll do a little bit of consulting, advising. I don't know. We haven't figured that all yet, but definitely enjoying this podcast as we go right now. So as we wrap up, my name is Doug Parker.
I'm Ed Rankin.
And we look forward to having success with you guys. Have a great day.